Before he makes his way to Metro Atlanta, President Trump is set to attend the dignified transfer of 4 U.S. service members who were killed in the Middle East. First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan, who lived in Georgia, Private Isabella Gonzalez, and Sergeant Angel Rampersad were killed over the weekend during an attack in Jordan. The fourth soldier, Sergeant Michael Emmanuel Swinton, was killed Sunday during a controlled detonation of a downed Iranian attack drone. Since the start of the war with Iran, 18 service members have been killed. In a post on Truth Social, President Trump compared the number of troops killed during the Iran war to those killed in previous conflicts. The president listed 6 U.S. military operations, their timeframes, and the number of soldiers who died in each one. President Trump did not source the numbers, but they appear to be aligned with the latest data from the Defense Department.